welcome again to the X Factor. I am absolutely thrilled, and I mean that seriously, to be joined by Dan Kremens. Many of you have seen Dan's active work on LinkedIn, where he shares a ton of great insight and content. Some of you may be familiar with his outstanding book, Winning Moves. If it's not on your bookshelf, it ought to be. Of all the private equity books I've read, it is absolutely the most field guide oriented text. 105 different levers that you can pull to create value in your portfolio companies, backed by data and tools and systems. And today, Dan's going to enlighten us with some of his insights on, let me get this right, Dan, how he works with private equity groups to help them drive people-powered value creation.
People-powered value creation, indeed. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for having me, man. This will be fun.
No, my pleasure. So tell everybody kind of how you got where you are today and what your practice looks like.
Yeah, the quick version is after an early career, couple of stints in operations management and investment research, I ended up stumbling my way, and I sincerely mean that, sort of stumbling my way into private equity in 2007. In retrospect, wholly unqualified to have landed a private equity job that early and that naive in my career, but through some dumb luck at right place at the right time, I ended up linking up with an awesome firm out on the West Coast called Alpine Investors. Alpine's done some really cool, innovative, and impactful stuff in the way of how do you bring people to the fore of the private equity investing equation. So a lot of my experience, expertise today, a lot of my business today is really shaped by that experience of having seen the benefit of really taking an intentional approach to working with, learning from, and investing behind exceptional people in these companies. So over the arc of a 12 or 13 year career there, I did a lot of different things. I've sourced deals, I've done deals, I've sat on the board of different PE-backed companies. I stood up a lot of our portfolio support capabilities, at least in the kind of 0 to 1 phase, whether it was recruitment or playbook. And so I've seen the same private equity movie from a bunch of different chairs. I don't claim to be especially good at any one of those functional disciplines, but at least have the unique perspective of having done a lot of different things within private equity, including operating within PE-backed companies.
Yep. Okay. So you've lived on both sides of the equation, and now you're straddling it, I suppose.
That's right. That's right. Which just gives a really unique vantage point. This probably goes without saying, but having sat in the operator chair, I have just a lot more empathy for what it takes to make the numbers that private equity guys and gals see on a spreadsheet happen. Sitting in the private equity chair, I've also had the unique vantage point of being able to have seen value creation from a higher level. And what's the old adage? It's tough to read the label of a jar if you're stuck inside of it. Too many portfolio company leaders get stuck inside the jar and can benefit from having a private equity partner at their wing who can just help them see things from a higher altitude. So it's been really cool, informative experience to have seen the private equity movie from both of those chairs.
Yeah, I've got to believe a big part of your role is to bridge the gap of understanding, perspective, and language between operators and investors.
No doubt. No doubt. I play that role naturally today. That's not a product offering of mine as translator, but that's a role that I play in a lot of the work I do today, working with and through private equity groups to support their portfolio companies. It was also a big reason why I wrote the book, was to help operators to understand how private equity thinks about value creation, the language that's used, the mental model and framework that's used, in an effort to translate, as you said, and in so doing, improve the odds that operators within PE-backed companies can be successful in delivering on the value creation expectations.
There's no doubt that we hear on a regular basis from sponsors that if it modeled out in a spreadsheet, it ought to be true in terms of manifesting it in operations and what happened.
That's not how it works.
That's evidently there's a middle step there. So what are maybe 2 or 3 of the bigger misconceptions that you find management has about how private equity thinks, and what our audience can do to kind of calibrate their thinking to their very important stakeholder audience of their sponsor?
Mm. One of the misconceptions, I think this is changing, but one of the misconceptions out there, I'm going to paint in maybe unfairly broad brushstrokes here, but there's this old sort of long-standing stink that private equity has, particularly among founders and entrepreneurs, as being the big bad wolf. Hey, they're, and I think a lot of this harkens back to the barbarians at the Gates days, the early days of private equity, where returns were made by gutting these businesses and leaving them to die. I'm being intentionally dramatic in my language, but I think there are a lot of case studies from the early days of PE that sort of validate that, and I think have created this stink around private equity. I think that stink was probably deserved for a period of time, but to answer your question directly, the misconception is that all private equity firms are out there just to cost cut their way to EBITDA growth and returns. And in the quote unquote value creation era of private equity, which I talk a lot about in the book, a lot of firms out there who are thinking long and hard and putting resources and mind share behind how do we build enduring businesses here, not just rely on cost cutting and financially engineering and value buying to generate our returns. So a lot of very well-intentioned private equity firms, a lot that are doing much in the way of investment and playbooks and resources to help their portfolio companies grow and succeed. So I think that's a little bit of a misconception. I also think there's a misconception that private equity firms have it all figured out. For this book, I interviewed dozens of PE leaders, both at a firm level and in operating companies. And one of the things that became apparent to me in doing that is there are private equity firms that have really well-developed points of view on how to grow companies. But there's still a big reliance on, despite the fact that private equity people have MBAs and use the big language, there's still a big reliance on having high quality operators at these companies who can actually take the stated intention of the private equity group that exists on these models in the investment committee decks and translate it into real performance. And so despite the fact that private equity, probably claims to have it all figured out, I think there's still a lot we can learn from, hopefully from books like this, which is not a credit to my own, wisdom, but really just this book is a product of wisdom of, dozens and dozens of leaders that I've interviewed for the book. And I think there's just a lot we can draw on out there from both operators and private equity folks alike to help operators win. And in so doing, help their private equity sponsor win.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the more we can equip our operating community with a full arsenal of initiatives and ideas and areas where they can ply their trade, the more they can spend their time on offense, and the less time they have to spend dealing with inbound inquiries and cross-examinations from the board that may be well-founded, but could be distracting and take them away from the real work that's going to move that EBITDA number year in and year out.
No doubt. No doubt.
Yeah.
And some of this communication gap that you mentioned earlier, use the word translation. Some of this communication gap is to blame for just the friction that exists between boards and management companies. And I to be fair, I've found myself in this position before where I felt like I was sort of speaking one language, my portfolio company CEO was speaking a different language, and the two were not meshing. And this book is not the only way to help bridge that gap, but I think having a shared language among investors and leadership is critical to everything that follows in a board setting and otherwise.
Yeah, agreed. The other comment you made around building enduring companies, I fully second that notion, because at least in the middle market, anecdotally, 2 out of 3 exits don't go to strategics, they go to other private equity firms.
Right.
And most of them want to invest in healthy, durable assets that still have white space and room to grow and opportunities to build a new investment thesis on the foundation that exists. But This is not about cutting our way to an EBITDA number and hoping to sell that business.
Yeah, great. That's a great point, especially in light of just the exit trends out there. When I do post-closing work with leadership teams and their board on value creation planning, which is just sort of a catch-all term for where are we trying to take this thing? What's our vision? What's our plan for getting there? When I started doing this work, I would frame it in terms of what's the 5-year plan for this business, and that being a good proxy for the average hold period. And what I realized over time is these businesses actually need a 10-year plan. Not because every bit, every pixel of what this business is going to or should look like 10 years from now, but because when you go to sell 5 years from now, you need to sell the next 5 years. You need to sell the dream to the next private equity buyer. Mm-hmm. And so building your business, approaching value creation with a long horizon in mind is becoming especially important in light of what you said, which is that a lot of these PE-backed companies are being acquired by other private equity firms.
Yeah, no doubt. So let's pivot into this notion of value creation and the nexus of that with human capital, because I hear from my clients all the time, talent is the most important thing that we do. And I think they mean it sincerely, even though raising capital is important, deploying that capital is maybe the biggest pressure point they have.
Yep.
But truly, without great management teams to power these investments, it's all for naught. But yet I think sometimes private equity doesn't know how to back up that belief that talent is the most important thing with a broader value creation plan that encompasses talent. So just educate us a little bit on what kinds of things you get into and how a Dan Kremens coached company might look and feel a little different from one that's not, from a human capital standpoint.
Well, for starters, I'll just plus one something you said, which is I think there is pretty widespread recognition in PE land that people are important. People are critical to investment success. That much I think is widely understood. It doesn't take an MBA to understand that. But to your point, I think that where the gap there's a knowing doing gap where how do we translate that recognition that people are really important into a set of practices, principles, habits, ways of operating that actually allow us to unlock the talent advantage or the people advantage in these companies. So that's a lot of the void I fill is how do you help firms that are principally bought in to this idea and want to bring talent to the fore as a key strategy for how they win, and equip them with the things they need to do that. So you can kind of break this down into a few things, and I would say above all else, what is pretty widely applied in private equity businesses is the idea of a value creation plan. It looks different, takes different forms and shapes depending on the firm. Most private equity firms have some sort of approach, whether it's effective or not, it's a separate conversation, but have some sort of approach to developing a value creation plan. What I like to come in and do is once the value creation plan is understood, it begs a logical question, which is how do you get the right who into the right where necessary to make those things happen, make the things on your value creation plan happen. So I'm sort of coming to the world and trying to pioneer this thing I call the people plan, which is a supplement to the value creation plan. It's the peanut butter to the value creation plan's jelly, in a sense that it picks up right where the value creation plan leaves off and says, who do we need aboard to make this thing happen? And there's a whole process I use to help firms flush that out. But what ends up on the people plan, the way that I go about that is, first and foremost, what is the long-term vision for this business? And work backwards to reverse engineer what are the value creation initiatives that need to happen? What are the requirements in the role of the person who's going to lead each of those things? How do we, objectively determine, do we have the right person in that role today? And to the extent that we don't, how do we manufacture or how do we get the right person into that role? And that can come by way of, firing and hiring. It can come by way of developing. It can come by way of repurposing existing talent who has some of the skills, but maybe just isn't in a role that allows them to drive what they could most impactfully drive. So there's a bunch of different levers to actualizing a people plan like that. But I think it starts with answering the question of once we have a value creation plan, who do we need aboard to make this thing happen? And do we have that today or not?
Yeah, let me throw out a scenario I'll manufacture off the top of my head. So it's a new deal. Part of the investment thesis is pricing leverage, but no one on the team has really ever strategically and comprehensively raised prices. And so, in the absence of that, the private equity firm says, raise prices 15% and let's see what attrition looks like, and we'll go from there. I'm guessing that's a great opportunity for someone like you to pull back and say, hang on, everybody, let's have a conversation about how to do this artfully and thoughtfully and intentionally, to borrow one of your terms.
Yeah. Well, and for every value creation initiative that ends up on the VCP, pricing in this case being one of them, my simple rule of thumb is there needs to be a name that goes next to each of those. And to the extent that, you know, you've identified pricing as a big lever, it begs the question of, well, what capabilities do we need in a person driving that in order to feel confident that we can pull that lever effectively? And creating a simple, you know, this doesn't have to be a complicated scorecard or job description, but coming up with a bulleted list of requirements for the person driving that then puts you in a position to say, do we have those capabilities in the business today?
Mhm.
And if you don't, in this pricing example, if you don't, you can solve that by going and hiring somebody. In some cases, you can actually solve that by taking some of those skill sets that might be resident in another part of the business, and with some coaching and maybe some augmentation, getting a person who has some of those fundamental skill sets, but maybe not all the pattern recognition, in a place to at least contribute to that initiative. It could mean bringing in outside help, vendors who know pricing. So there's a bunch of different ways you can go about filling the name on that box. But however you do it, a name needs to go next to that initiative, and investors need to be confident that the person whose name goes in that has the stuff needed to deliver on the pricing lever.
Mhm.
So that, again, that may not be, it's probably not a, that's probably kind of obvious for a lot of people to, of course, you need the person with the right skills to make the thing happen. I just find that in a lot of these conversations, the discussion stops a step short of the who. It is declaring we're going to pull the pricing lever and then sort of hoping that the business figures it out. And the idea of the people plan takes that the next and final leg and says, how do we make sure that the person driving this can get the job done?
So I'm curious about training and development and how that factors into your planning, because particularly in the middle market, these are companies with finite resources. There
Yeah.
are only so many folks on the team. Budgets are capped at how much investment in outside consultants. No matter how much I try to remind my clients that we're an ad back, still they like to manage spending accordingly.
Yep.
So when you are developing the who around the what, how much, if any, does training and development and the acquisition of skills of the existing team, or newly hired team members come into play?
It's a great, if you're trying to solve for a lot of the work I do, a big part of my mission in life is to help these companies unlock people power performance. And I think where the collective private equity brain first goes when it comes to doing so is hiring. How do we just hire? How do we hire the right people? How do we get the right butts in the right seats, or the right people on the bus, or whatever? It's hiring. And I think that's a logical first place to go, because in a lot of cases, you need to hire into these businesses to fill key gaps that are important to fill to make your VCP happen. What I think gets overlooked, but I believe this is changing slowly but surely in private equity, is in addition to thoughtfully hiring, how do we actually understand the human beings that we're buying that are coming with this business? How do we create the environment? The environment can include the leadership, can include the culture, and it can include, more directly to your point, the training and development needed to unlock the potential that resides within those leaders.
Mhm.
So it's a long way of saying training and development, I think, has been overlooked historically in private equity. I believe that to be changing. I'm actually working on with an outside partner on standing up a training program that's sort of aimed at this issue. And what I have found anecdotally, having operated in PE-backed companies, is that these companies aren't short on talented human beings. There's a lot of latent talent that exists within PE-backed businesses. I liken it to a beach ball held underwater where, there's a lot of just potential energy that has yet to be unleashed. But
Mhm.
when you take your hands off the ball, which training and development can help do, that that latent skill and potential, can really can really surface and shine. And so there's some firms out there that are starting to do this really well. My old firm, Alpine Investors, has really really done an amazing job in developing the leaders within their portfolio companies, and it's paid off. It's paid off in a big way.
Yeah, their numbers speak for themselves. Great. So you talk about human capital as the number one meta lever for driving value creation, and I don't think anybody's going to dispute that. But there's a lot of a gap between, okay, we accept the premise, but what are we going to do about it? And so I like how you break it down into really three pillars. We're going to hire smarter, develop faster, and lead better. And I like the adverbs there, because hiring faster isn't necessarily good. Hiring smarter is the key. Nothing's more painful than replacing
Yeah.
a foul ball derailed hire. Developing faster, let's go quickly. Let's help people transform the same way we're helping companies transform, and lead better is all about effectiveness. So would you mind throwing a bone or two to our listeners and maybe give us a tactical example of each of the three, and maybe we'll start with hiring smarter.
Hiring smarter. The tactical advice I have, this one's an easy one, is go read the book Who by Jeff Smart and Randy Street. This is a lot of the work I do today around helping teams, helping private equity groups and their portfolio companies make smarter hiring decisions. I do a lot of executive assessment, is rooted in some of the principles in that book. I've sort of adapted some of my own approach to fit, private equity land a bit more tightly over time, but a lot of it's rooted in that book. And so I think when it comes to hiring, there's just it's one of those, it's like karaoke where everybody thinks they're good at hiring, but objectively, most people aren't,
Our
and
eardrums can collectively attest to that. There's no doubt.
yeah, well, I've interviewed hundreds of executives over time. I have reams and reams of interview data, and one of the things I consistently see is that every executive, whoever was, thinks their team was the best team, and if you go one step upstream of that, thinks they excel at hiring. But by contrast, the statistics around hiring hit rate and effectiveness are actually pretty dismal, and so that tells us there's sort of some, what they call it, Dunning-Kruger effect, where we think we're better at things than we actually are. That is at play in a big way when it comes to hiring in private equity. And so the call to action there is, first and foremost, look in the mirror and ask yourself the question, am I actually as good at this as I think I am? And what's the data that I can point to understand that? And number two, to the extent that you convince yourself that you're actually not as good at this as you think you are, and you're leaving something on the table as a result, go read the book Who, and go invest in and start to incur some of the learning cycles in developing a repeatable interview process and hiring process that can allow you to make more objective decisions. I have a lot to say around what that can look like, but I'll just leave it at that. Go read that book. It's a great starting point.
It's required reading for anybody who's serious about hiring. It's practical, it's well laid out, and although it's got to be 10 years or more aged at this point, it's still, in my view, as relevant today as it was when it came out.
Yeah, and there's some great assessment tools out there too that it's not really part of the Who methodology, but there's some great assessment tools out there that can help. Not as I don't ever recommend replacing a structured interview process with an assessment tool, but I think can be a great supplementation to a structured interview process.
Yeah, I always thought that the structured interview process gets at the skill set and the kind of domain and the experiential aspect, and the assessments can help square off on the behaviors. Are they going to look and feel like a private equity backed operator in terms of urgency, hands-on, speed and volume of decision making and those sorts of things. So we're
Yeah.
on the same page there.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's hire smarter. How about one quick tip for develop faster? We talked about it a little bit earlier, but what's a go-to quick solution that our listeners can think about employing?
There's sort of a nerdy answer to this question, which is, go figure out what the business needs, how that translates into role requirements. How do you teach the people in those roles what they need to live into those? That's sort of the nerdy, maybe obvious answer. But before I even talk about developing, I think the challenge I have for people is, never mind developing. How do you just tap into more of what already exists in these people? This is sort of the beach ball metaphor I was using earlier. I believe my experience has taught me in a lot of these companies, there's latent, sort of pent up potential that has yet to be translated into performance. And that can come by way of having bad managers. It can come by way of being in a system that just doesn't tap into people's best stuff. There's a variety of, I think, impediments to that. But one tool that I have long used in order to do this is this conversation that I call the blue flame conversation. The first book I ever wrote was a few years back on this topic, which is the core idea is, how do you use the power of conversation between a manager and their employee to get to the heart of what are their greatest strengths or talents, what most energizes them, and what brings them a sense of meaning. The shorthand for those, call it, your talents or your skills, your passion and your purpose. And how can managers understand those things first and foremost? And once they do understand them, put people in a position that is optimized to let those things shine. Put them in a position that aligns with their greatest strengths, put them in a position where they're doing work they find energizing, and put them in a position where they can find a sense of meaning in their work. And sometimes I mean quite literally put them in a position, move them into a role that better aligns with those things. Sometimes it means recrafting their existing job description. Sometimes it means taking things off their plate and replacing them with things that are going to create more energy for them. But this is once you identify the sort of the intersection point of those three forces, your strengths, your purpose, your passion, and you position people to do work that aligns with that in and of itself, I think can help to tap into a lot of this unexploited potential in people. The next horizon then is, well, how do you help people grow and develop in their role? But I think that's a good starting point for people. Just go on the search for what exists within my people today, which I'm really not capitalizing on.
Yeah, love it. Okay, last pillar, lead better. I know for me that means things like accountability and delivering on outcomes, but leadership is a broad topic. We're not going to diagnose it in a soundbite. But when you see better leaders, is there a single trait or two that tends to come to mind?
Better leaders first and foremost, nail the basics. There's a lot we could say around the traits of effective leaders. I've got a lot of thoughts on that topic, but when it comes to something that's, things that are more actionable that leaders can go do to quote unquote lead better, I would just encourage everybody to, before passing go, first nail the basics. And basics include things like creating clarity on what success looks like in a role. Basics include, how do you have a consistently applied hiring process for bringing new people into your business? Basics include, how do we give feedback in a continuous way, and in a way that aligns back to the expectations of the role or the definition of success in the role. So these are just a lot of pretty basic, fundamental general management principles that I have found in really heady conversations about leadership often get overlooked. And I've also found firsthand, working in and with companies, despite the fact that we in the ivory tower think that these things are just happening in companies, there's in a lot of lower mid-market businesses, we need to go back to the basics of how do we just create clarity for people on what success looks like in their role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that. And in my world, anecdotally, we always look for executives who have had team members follow them from one investment hold period to another, and the premise being that they're a great leader. But I'm sure what's at the cornerstone of that rationale by those that decided to follow said individual is exactly what you just said. So, well, listen, this has been fantastic. For those that don't have it, let me just say Winning Moves, go to Amazon right now, Winning Moves, Dan Kremens, get yourself a copy. You don't even have to read it cover to cover. Open up a page, dig in, pull out an idea, think about it, throw it out to your team. It's a great field guide to help spur better thinking. And I just got a couple notes here. So I think a few takeaways for me in that value creation plan. Make sure there's a name next to every what, who's going to have that domain and who's going to own that outcome. I think that's great. And then we're going to hire smarter, and people ought to take a look at the book Who for a great reference point. We're going to develop faster. And before we get into creating new skills, let's make sure we've unlocked all the latent pent-up potential in that individual today. So we're dealing with all 8 cylinders firing versus less than that, and help folks tap into that confluence of talent, energy, and meaning. And then let's lead by doing the basics really well. Like an athlete or any other practitioner of their craft, they continuously reinforce the basics to be world-class. So what did I forget, Dan? Any last words of wisdom you want to leave folks with today?
No, great summary. And I think that hits a lot more in the book about how to do those 3 things. But I think that's a good summary.
Well, reach out to Dan on LinkedIn, grab the book. And if you're looking at an engagement to better develop your human capital plan, give Dan a call. He'll be the BASF of your world. He won't make your company what it is, but he'll make it run better for sure. So Dan, thank you so much for joining today. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you out there in the market.
Thanks for having me, man. And thanks for the work that you're doing in the world to help up level CXOs and in private equity backed businesses. I think it's really cool.
Yep, we're in it together. That's for sure.
That's right.
Okay.